Today I'd like to talk about some orcs who get their job done fast. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. In today's video we're continuing in our Orc series and looking at the Stormboyz and having a talk about their role in a competitive Orc army. In this video we'll take a look at their datasheet, any obvious rules, buffs and synergies, and how I would run them on the tabletop in the current 8th edition. In the background, Orc Stormboyz are boys who are propelled towards the enemy by an enormous rocket contraption. It might vary very greatly in its engineering boy to boy, depending on what the Orc mechs feel like coming up with that day, and they're propelled at breakneck speeds towards the enemy and serve very much as Orc shock troopers for their army. Despite this vaguely lunatic tendency, Stormboyz are, by the standards of regular boys in the Waaagh, somewhat more disciplined and ordered than the standard mobs, and actually understand a fair amount of tactical acumen for mobile warfare and being able to strike a hammer blow where it counts. This even goes so far as to maintaining basic uniform, polishing their boots in public places, and actually having a fair amount of regard for their gear's maintenance. Because of these tendencies, Stormboyz are far more common in the Goth and Blood Axe clans, whose hard-nosed mentality does predispose to this sort of nature. All that being said, Stormboyz are very much still orcs, and they still live for getting stuck into the enemy in a good scrap, and after their high-minded ideals have got them into close combat, they'll very much happily lay about any opponent with slugger and chopper, just like anyone else. So let's see what these mobs can do on the tabletop then. As always, thanks to Warhammer for the excellent datasheet. So in game, Stormboyz come in a unit of fast attack for the orcs. As base they come as a unit of 5 Stormboyz, but they can be expanded to the enormous mob size of 30. A boss nob can take the place of 1 Stormboy, and every model in the unit is armed with slugger, chopper and stick bombs. In terms of profile, they have the exact same profile as a standard orc boy, except they have 12-inch movement and the fly keyword, which is absolutely excellent for an orc, as it means they'll be getting towards the enemy far faster than if they were just running along on foot. They pay a 2-point premium over standard boys for this, where the standard boys are 7 points, these guys are 9 points, which I feel is a fairly well balanced trade-off with this extra mobility and their extra abilities. In terms of extra options, the boss nob can replace his slugger and chopper with items from the nob weapons list, so if you want you can have a power claw or kill saws or a big chopper, but unlike standard boy squads, these guys are always armed with slugger and chopper, you don't have the option for shooters or big shooters or things. In terms of special rules, they have the standard Here We Go for re-rolling charges, which is particularly handy coming out of Deep Strike. They have Mob Rule, which is great for being in units of 30 or so, meaning that they'll be far more resistant to morale and make others more resistant as well. And they also have Daka for that little bit of extra damage output with those sluggers. Now compared with standard mobs of boys, they don't get extra attacks when there's 20 or more models in the unit, but they do trade that out for 2 other special rules. The first one is an excellent one called Full Throttle, which means that when this unit advances, you just add plus 6 inches to the move characteristic instead of rolling a dice. But if you do, then you roll 1d6 for each model in the unit, and if you roll a roll of 1, then the unit suffers 1 mortal wound. So this at the same time is quite a powerful asset and quite a bad drawback, both in the same go. Auto-advancing 6 means that you'll be guaranteed to have an 18-inch movement, and if you have a war boss anywhere nearby, which can be quite easy to achieve if you have a very large unit where you can chain back to one, it means that you could have an absolutely crazy threat range of about 26 inches on average for any standard orc clan, or up to a pretty crazy 29 inches if you're evil sons, thanks to them getting +1 to move, advance and charge. This means that you're rarely going to be safe from these guys. They can literally hit you from halfway across the board in a single turn, and if your opponent makes the mistake of deploying on the line when you have deployed Stormboyz on the line, then you're pretty much odds on to get into close combat with them. However, that crazy mobility does come at a downside. You'll essentially be losing 1/6 of the unit every time you make that extra movement, and they are fairly expensive models as orcs go. If you can get away without doing it, then you should certainly do this, but I do find that in quite a lot of situations it is going to be worth getting that extra movement and paying the cost in boys. As the damage comes in as mortal wounds rather than slain models, it does mean that if you're snake bites or have a pain boy or Makari around, then you can have the chance of saving a few of them, though admittedly with a 6+ feel no pain is not exactly the biggest chance. Their other excellent mobility rule is their Stormboyz Strike rule. This is essentially their Deep Strike reserve ability, where they can come in at the end of the movement save anywhere that's greater than 9 inches from enemy models. In this scenario, they actually become very similar to Slugger and Chopper Boys, but you've plonked in the Teleporter for 2 command points, so you can sort of make the call as to whether or not you want to pay 2 points more per model, or pay those 2 command points at the start of the game. I think both of them have their merits to saving them. It's certainly helpful to be able to keep them flexible. Sometimes you might want to start them on the board, and sometimes you might want to put them in deep strike, so I find it's pretty handy to be able to tailor depending on what you're facing on the table. Once they're actually down and have deep struck, the boys will generally be a little bit more killy because they get those extra attacks for big units, but the Stormboyz will have far more mobility and the fly rule for subsequent turns, so that's another bit of a trade-off if you are planning on deep striking them. Finally, it's worth noting that the fly keyword will give them a few more advantages. As well as just movement, it does allow them to be able to charge and hit planes hand to hand, which can actually be really important in certain matchups if you're playing against Eldar flyers, and it's pretty helpful to be able to drop in a big unit of boys that can just charge the things straight out, and hopefully deal a ton of damage to them. So overall, Stormboyz are very similar to standard boys, with the fly word and going much quicker with built-in deep strike, but losing extra attacks for big units and the various ranged options that standard boys can get. So let's talk a little bit more about how we can get more out of them on the table. First of all, as per normal, we have the choice of clan, and a few ones absolutely stand out for me. Evil Sons, as per normal, synergise amazingly with the Stormboyz. They synergise very well with their ludicrous movement with advancing and charging, as we'd already mentioned, but it's also pretty handy to get that +1 to charge out of deep strike, which just means that they're much more reliable at getting in once you've started them off in reserve. Death Skulls are another decent shout, having 6+ invul saves, making the unit a fair bit tougher, some extra rerolls if you have a Power Claw knob or something in close combat, and they also gain their ability for the infantry to be objective secured. Blood Axes can help out a little bit with being a bit tougher at long range, but I think that the main advantage of them with Stormboyz is being able to fall back and disengage, and using that excessive movement to be able to go and charge something else that you want to. Blood Axe Stormboyz are going to have to be eliminated unless the enemy wants them jumping all over their lines. Goths have their normal extra little bit of flat damage in the combat phase, Snake Boys have a little bit of survivability, and Freebooters might potentially be able to get +1 to hit, though it's not very reliable to get off in the fight phase. But in general, my favourite clans for them are the Evil Sons, followed by the Death Skulls. The specialist mobs do have a couple of interesting offerings for the Stormboyz as well. Firstly, there's unsurprisingly the flyboyz, which will give your Stormboyz the benefit of cover, and it also makes them -1 to hit in close combat. If you were taking a specialist detachment of just Stormboyz, then these are a pretty reasonable set of advantages. Provided your opponent doesn't have ignores cover, then it means that they'll just be that little bit tougher to shooting and a little bit harder to hit in the fight phase. Whether that's worth giving up the extra movement and better chance of making a deep strike charge though, is kind of up to you. The other subculture that I find quite interesting are the Hunters Sneaky Devils, which will give any Stormboyz in a unit a 5+ invul save if they're on or inside a terrain piece, and they also gain an extra -1 to their AP of their combat weapons if the enemy unit is on or within a terrain feature as well. Now I think the Stormboyz are one of the units that can best use this one, as they're able to use their great movement to actually reach these terrain pieces, so you do have the potential for a decent defensive and offensive upgrade with this one. It might require you to take a specialist detachment just for those Stormboyz, but it could be another interesting way to run them. It is a touch unreliable though, as it's pretty dependent on how much terrain there is on the board. In terms of character support, Stormboyz, much like regular boys, are one of those units that you can really do quite a lot with in terms of using the key buffs from the Ork Codex. We already mentioned that they're great with advancing and charging for war bosses, being able to receive those ludicrously long threat ranges. If you are starting on the board, then it's well worth being under the protection of a custom force field to blunt as much of the enemy shooting as is possible, and likewise you can have a pain boy nearby, both to add to this durability and also hopefully patch some of them up when they explode with their rocket packs. Weird boys are a little bit less useful for them than some of them, seeing as they can basically jump in themselves. They don't need to be jumping around with Orc psychic powers that much, but something like Warpath could still be excellent for getting the best out of them in melee. Finally, if you are playing Goths, you do have the potential to run them alongside Boss Zagstruck. He's an 88-point fighty character, who in theory should be excellent for leading Stormboyz, but unfortunately his special rules are a little bit lackluster. The only actual synergy that he has with leading Stormboyz is that he makes them pass morale checks when they're within 6 inches of him. I'm not saying it's by any means useless, but generally in Orc armies, provided we're positioning big mobs of 30 near each other, then morale doesn't tend to be the biggest problem. It would have been nicer for him to have something to buff their damage output or something, in my opinion. Stratagem-wise, the Stormboyz do tend to lose out a little bit compared with their regular boy brothers, in particular not being able to use things like Mob Up or Endless Green Tide are significant disadvantages. Crotch Shields is a pretty decent shout with a Stormboy unit though. It means that you can afford to put one Stormboy unit fairly aggressively up in your deployment zone, and if you string a big unit of Gretchen out the front of them, then it means that they'll have to chew through an entire unit of Grots before they can gun down those guys. And if you do put some at the front of your deployment zone, then you could easily be getting a charge straight from turn 1 and take the fight right to the enemy. If a vehicle happens to die near them, then one command point for loot it really isn't the worst idea in the world. Any extra durability that you can get on this quite fragile point-for-point unit is great. 3 command points for get stuck in lads could easily be worth it with the amount of attacks a big squad can get, and it might be particularly worth it if it's going to make the difference between consolidating into other enemy units or not, or potentially tying up an enemy unit via tri-pointing them and stopping them from just falling back and shooting you. Finally, having a couple spare for auto-pass morale could be quite useful as well. I feel that Stormboyz are one of the units that if just a few survive up and close to the enemy, then they can really have an annoying impact on the game far more than their actual numbers dictate. Swooping over to tie up an enemy unit and contest an objective could actually be pretty game changing. So how would I actually tend to use Stormboyz in game then? First of all, I think in general Stormboyz are one of the units that profit from being a very big squad. I think big units tend to be more optimal, something along the lines of 20 to 30. They are pretty expensive in terms of real world money for actual points units, particularly as they didn't always used to be able to be taken in quite such big numbers. In general, I'd advocate putting some sort of fighty power weapon on the knob, either a power claw or a kill saw, just as they are going to be some of the units that are going to be able to reach some hard to get to targets, so giving them the extra bit of clout to put some decent damage on them is a worthwhile investment in my mind. In terms of how many Stormboyz to take in your army, I think you really do have to consider about when your other threats are going to be arriving. If your Stormboyz are planning on starting on the board, and you're running a lot of slow foot slogging boys, then it might not actually be the most optimal scenario. Basically, if you jump your Stormboyz up really far forward first, then they're the ones that are going to get shot, leaving your opponent a bit of breathing space before they deal with the rest of your boy horde. Earlier on in the edition, I did see people running 90 strong Stormboy mobs with 3 huge units of 30, just because if you have that many, you're going to overwhelm your opponent's ability to deal with that massive first wave, and some are going to be left alive, being able to cause havoc in their next charge phase. So if you're just going for the absolute raw numbers approach, then either I think that you need a lot of them, or you need to pair them with other big fast moving threats, such as say a unit of Ork boys that are jumping halfway across the board, or other fast movers coming in very quickly. In general, you just don't want one unit of Stormboyz painting a massive target on themselves. Having said that, I do think that one could be a bit more viable if you are planning on dedicating some grots to them, stopping them from getting shot first turn, and then use them as a bit of a counter punch to deal a big blow to enemy units in the midfield. And of course, depending on the opponent, you always have the option of deep striking them, where you're sort of just paying a premium on the boys for them to be able to come out of nowhere on turn 2 or turn 3, in addition to any units that you might have jumped this turn. So if starting on the board, certainly think about getting them under the cover of a custom force field if you have one. Try and hide as many as you can out of line of sight or in cover, and cozy up to any pain boys. I'd also ideally want to have a war boss somewhere that can allow them to advance and charge if they need to, although hopefully if the war boss moves forward as well, then you should be able to chain enough Stormboyz back to him so that you can at least get that charge off if you do need the extra 6 inches. From there you can react pretty easily to what your opponent does with that great movement. You could potentially look to tie up on wrap and trap models in the midfield, or jump forward excessively far and try and engage and tie up enemy tanks to stop them shooting, and just generally make a big nuisance of themselves wherever they might land. If they're coming out of deep strike, I'd set them up somewhere where you have multiple targets to make a 9-inch charge on, and I would be just a little bit wary as to using the sluggers if it is going to make your charge range longer. You really don't just want to kill 1 or 2 models and make yourself have a 10 or 11-inch charge compared with a nice 9-inch one that you had before. I do feel that deep striking is a lot more of a viable strategy with the Evil Sons as well, because they're just better at it. Once you're actually in combat, naturally deal damage wherever you can, aim to wrap and trap enemy units via tri-pointing them, and with their good movement and large number of models, you should be able to fan them out a little bit to contest objectives and tie up other units. I'd certainly consider fighting twice with them if it's going to make a big difference. Much like standard boys, there's very little that won't break once you throw a ton of strength 4 hits at them. Overall, I'd say that Stormboyz are a very decently competitive unit in the Ork army list, much in the same way that boys are. They're basically a variant on them that trade a couple of points in price and a bit of the raw damage for extreme movement flexibility and the ability to deep strike depending on matchup. So let me know your thoughts on the Stormboyz down in the comments below, particularly if there's any strategies or tactics that you think I've missed. We'll be most certainly continuing the Ork video series over the next few weeks, so if there's anything that you'd particularly like to see, let me know down in the comments, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more. If you've been enjoying the channel's videos, then feel free to take a look at the channel's Patreon page, which is how I have the time to keep on making these videos, as well as helping keep the videos coming. There's a few other benefits for Patreon members, such as seeing some videos early, voting on what sort of videos I make next, and the occasional prize draw where I post out some miniatures to one of the Patreons. If any of that sounds interesting to you, then please give it a look, the link is in the description below. And of course a massive thank you to my current Patreons for making this channel possible. In any case, a big thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.